Good morning, everyone. Excellency, colleagues from the UN system, fellow NGO representatives, dear friends. On behalf of the NGO Committee for Social Development, it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all to the Civil Society Forum 2019. My name is Monica Jahangir Chaudhary, and I actually clearly remember sitting in this room 2 years ago, attending my first Civil Society Forum, and being delighted to meet so many inspiring individuals coming from all parts of the world, eager to share their concerns, yes, but most importantly, eager to share their knowledge, their expertise, their projects, their hopes and their ambitions to build a better world for all. So I hope that today you can use this space, the space of the Civil Society Forum, to connect between NGOs and to build a stronger global NGO community. I would like to take a moment to thank those who made this day possible. Special thanks to Lynn Hensler-Hirsch and Mary D'Amato-Rizzi from the Executive Committee for putting so much energy and efforts into the preparation of this day. Thank you also to all the volunteers, and including the interpreters who are interpreting for you today, and to the funders, without whom this day wouldn't be possible at all. Before we turn to our distinguished speakers, I would like to say a few words in relation to the theme of the Civil Society Forum, which is also the theme of the Commission. I know that we all know the theme by heart by now, but I will read it once again. Addressing inequalities and challenges to social inclusion through fiscal, wage, and social protection policies. Now, since the beginning of the week, we have been discussing how inequalities, be they economic or social inequalities, or inequalities in opportunities, or inequalities in outcomes. So we've been discussing how inequalities are a defining issue of our times. And I think that a very glaring example of that is just to see the number of people who are taking to the streets, how much exhausted and oppressed they are, trying to make ends meet, trying to survive, trying to ask for decent wages. So just think of the yellow jackets in France, or think of the female garments workers in Bangladesh, or think of the public sector workers on strike in Tunisia. So all those spontaneous movements are challenging the traditional structures and institutions of their countries, but also they are questioning our own capacity to carry their messages at the United Nations. How can we, civil society representatives, rethink our own capacity to pass on their grievances from the streets to the UN? I think this is a question of economic and social justice, but this is also a question of democracy. And in this view, we should also keep in mind those who are too fragile and socially isolated to protest and voice their concerns. What about those who live in such dire conditions that they have lost all political power and voices? What about those who have become invisible in the eyes of policymakers? I think this is our responsibility as the NGO global community to reach those who are most furthest behind and make sure that their interests are reflected into our advocacy here at the UN and that their participation is made possible. I'll just finish by saying that inequality and poverty are not inevitable. This is what we learn in the different high-level panels of this week. It is a matter of political choice, and ultimately those political choices reflect the kind of society we want to see for ourselves and for the future generations, not a society that encourages division, greed, materialism, and individualism, but hopefully a society that celebrates solidarity, empathy, justice, and equity. And with that, I will now turn to our first speaker, His Excellency Ambassador Barrot from the Permanent Mission of Senegal to the United Nations. As you know, the Permanent Mission of Senegal is chairing the Commission. Ambassador Barrot will deliver his message in French, so feel free to use this for interpretation. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Monica, for giving me the floor. I will make my statement in French. So, avant tout, je voudrais d'abord présenter les regrets de l'ambassadeur Cheikh Niang, président de la CSocD, qui n'a pas pu être là parce que justement il a d'autres engagements aujourd'hui au niveau donc des Nations Unies. Il m'a demandé donc de dire ces quelques mots, notamment pour souligner la valeur de la société civile au niveau des Nations Unies. Une société civile donc capable de lire la réalité sous un angle différent. Nous essayons tous de lire le monde et chaque perspective contribue assurément à notre compréhension de ce monde. Donc il faut dire que seule une lecture globale, mais aussi...
We are trying to look for the most appropriate solutions. Yes. So I was saying, I believe that these types of spaces for civil society are crucial, and we must learn together how to take advantage of these communal spaces. I would like to very briefly just underline a few important points. The importance of and the role of governments and of partnerships in order to reduce inequalities, and the importance of promoting social cohesion. That all of the societies in the world are struggling against currently. It is likewise very important to be aware of the context of the agenda that we have before us today, so that we can aim for a larger inclusion, social inclusion. Another important aspect is political will to achieve these goals for civil society. We, of course, have to focus on our common struggle to reduce inequalities and poverty. The president of the Committee for Social Development has expressed the importance of collaborating very closely across all sectors of civil society. Thank you very much.
We really appreciate the openness and willingness of your mission to work with civil society. I will now turn to our next speaker, Ms. Daniela Abbas, Director of the Division for Inclusive and Social Development with UNDESA. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Your Excellency and colleagues and NGO representatives, and among you also quite a few friends, I hope. I would really like to thank the NGO committee for the that supports the Commission for Social Development, as well as the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for organizing this forum. You know, I asked myself, what is social protection? Because we use this expression, but I really wanted to make sure that I understand what social protection is. And I looked at the United Nations, the definition of the given to this by the United Nations Institute of Research, based in Geneva. And UNRIST says, social protection is preventing, is managing, is overcoming situations that adversely affect people's well-being. And then I wanted to read a little bit more about the definition of social protection, looking at other literature. And it means protecting and helping people who are living in situations that can be cause of vulnerability. Could be age, could be having a disability temporarily or permanently, could be being displaced, it could be being unemployed or sick. And so I ask myself another question. How and what the private and the public initiatives can provide income, distribution of wealth, or consumption transfers to those people suffering from poverty in order to enhance their social, economic, and political status. And I think that this is what we want to discuss today in this forum. What kind of good practices are you familiar with, are you aware of, that can be brought here to the discussion? Not so much talking about the diagnosis where the problem lies, but we would be nice to find also the treatment. Now, old treatments to a new sickness, because inequality is changing its face, and it differs depending on which country we're focusing on. So if we want to call that kind of a sickness, a bacteria, what kind of medicine can we use to treat it? Because I have the feeling that we keep treating new bacteria with old medicines. So it would be interesting to know what in the laboratories, that is the NGOs, what your laboratories are seeing. If you had a chance, an opportunity to do an analysis, say, of what happened during the last 10 years, from when we were discussing about inequalities, because it was already on the table. We didn't need the 2030 agenda to start talking about inequalities. We have been talking about inequalities since the United Nations has been established, right? But definitely, because the phenomenon now is becoming so explosive, it had to be included as one of the main 17 goals the world wants to find the solution to, or at least reduce the gap of inequalities to as much as possible. So in your laboratories, did you have a chance to do the analysis of how this bacteria has developed throughout the last 10 years? And what solutions were found meanwhile that proved to be successful? And so what is your projection based on the trend that you have analyzed for the next 10, 15 years? That's where we have to gather together here in the space given by the United Nations and start putting solutions on the table. And say, you know what? This year we're meeting here at this forum. What kind of challenge are we giving ourselves as laboratories to bring a solution and some very interesting food for thought and thought leadership next year? And presently, since we are here, how can we contribute to the success of this commission by providing advice and supporting the endeavors of member states? And maybe next year, there might be also some groups from the private sector here, because they are not NGOs, but definitely they are part of the civil society. And that's where things happen. And then we can discuss them here and try to give a frame to what has been discussed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bass, for this call to NGOs to bring our expertise here at the United Nations. I will now turn to Ms. Bettina Louise Rurup, who is the Executive Director of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, New York. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Excellency, dear Daniela Abbas, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. It's a great pleasure and also a privilege to address this distinguished gathering and to welcome you all to this year's Civil Society Forums to the 57th Commission for Social Development at the United Nations. Many of you know that the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung has been a close ally and supporter of the Civil Society Forum since the first social summit in Copenhagen in 1995. You might also know that the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung is a progressive think tank involved with educational and policy-oriented programs. Inspired by the core values of social democracy, freedom, justice, and solidarity, FES runs programs with offices in about 110 countries worldwide, having a very strong focus on countries in the global south. Facilitating dialogue among different stakeholders, bringing together academia and practitioners, parliamentarians and citizens, business and trade unions, civil society and governments, local organizations with national institutions, aiming at consensus building and bringing about viable solutions has been at the core of our work. In our understanding, social inclusion and real democracy go hand in hand. They are intrinsically linked to each other and cannot have one without the other. Over the past years, the Commission on Social Development has been the place to address the challenges and gaps in social justice. In the spirit of the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development, where member states had agreed as early as in 1995 on the need to work jointly on creating an economic, social, and political environment that will enable people to achieve social development. This civil society forum has been a space to bring different dimensions of social development together at the Commission, and also to support, with the support of the 2030 Agenda and emphasizing the 17 goals of the 2030 Agenda. It has been very important, but I would say it needs to become even more important. At FES, we have been working both on the processes as well as on the substance. We have worked with the International Coalition for Social Protection Floors, a group of roughly 90 organizations which have done research and advocacy. We are also part of the SPIAC-B group, bringing together UN agencies and IFIs, as well as civil society organizations and also member states, to foster the right to universal social protection. And we're also working in many different settings with civil society, with trade unions, with business, with parliamentarians and government on wage and fiscal policies. This year's deliberations at the Civil Society Forum take place in times when international cooperation itself is under attack. Trust in multilateral agreements is waning and needs to be strengthened and made coherent with one another. Social exclusion and inequality has been on the agenda for some time now. More and more people, agencies, and governments recognize the overall detrimental effect of inequalities on societies, on economies, and on polities. The social fabric is fraying in many places, as also the report of the Secretary General of last November points out. Inequality is no longer just a moral or human rights issue, but also a topic for macroeconomic policies. It's very clear that we need a paradigm shift in economic and social policies to overcome the current levels of poverty, deprivation, and inequality. Universal social protection systems need to be strengthened, and as traditional informal support systems are no longer in place to counterbalance policies of neglect and exclusion. Multilateral institutions can and must play their role in coming up with inequality, reducing and social inclusion favoring policies. But governments play an indispensable role in creating and maintaining public institutions, in prioritizing public and fiscal policies, in bringing stakeholders together and working hand in hand towards the public good. Civil society organizations can be and have been important agents of change, providing a perspective from the grassroots, building capacities and empowering people in general, but particularly women, old age, youth, and those with special needs. Trade unions play an important role in voicing workers' rights and collectively bargaining for decent work and common good. Empirical evidence shows very clearly that policies such as good wage policies and enforcement of labor rights are putting an end to illicit financial flows and setting up and broadening tax systems, for example, reduce inequalities and increase well-being and happiness overall. It's not witchcraft, as we say in Germany. It can be done, and it must be done. Let me conclude with articulating my deep appreciation for the tremendously important work carried out by all of you here. We would not be where we are right now with regard to important international agreements and achievements if it would not be for your work and engagement, empathy, and solidarity. I would also like to thank the NGO Committee for Social Development for organizing, again, this year's Civil Society Forum in a tremendously in a very perfect way, and particularly Daniel Perel and his team. But also, I would like to thank His Excellency Abdoulaye Barrow, DPR of Senegal, as well as the chair of the 57th Commission of the Social Development, and as well as the relentlessly active director of the Division for Inclusive Social Development, Mrs. Daniela Abbas. I hope this Civil Society Forum works in a two-folded way, strengthening the work on the ground through exchange of expertise, mutual learning, and networking, as well as feeding into the multilateral system, which needs the experience, the perspectives, and the critical support of solidarity of civil society more than ever. I would also now just briefly say that I'm very pleased to that we have Ms. Helen Modura here from the Africa Platform for Social Protection, whom we invited as a speaker to learn and benefit from her vast experience and expertise working on social protection and transformative policies. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I hand over to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rurup, for all the work that FES supports in the world and for, of course, supporting the Civil Society Forum from the beginning. Ms. Helen Modura, a human rights defender who is currently serving as a program manager at the Africa Platform for Social Protection. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, sir, representatives of various departments and institutions of the United Nations, representatives of various government offices, representatives of civil society organizations, ladies and gentlemen. In order to affirm the role of civil society in promoting rights, I am reminded in 2011 when an organization I worked for hosted delegates from other countries in Africa for an exchange visit. Part of the itinerary included visiting various government ministries and institutions to understand the relationship and linkages between government and civil society organizations. Kenya had at that time enacted a new constitution. The guests had this question in almost all the visits. Why does Kenya seem to make so much progress in many areas, especially in legal and policy? Regardless of which ministry or department was asked this question, the answer, surprisingly, was the same. They all said, we have a very vibrant civil society organization. This acknowledgement by the state that things would be much slower in the absence of a strong civil society gave me faith and hope in the work that we as civil society organizations do. It made me realize that although a lot of times our governments often feel that civil society organizations are a bother, deep down their souls, they acknowledge the contribution made by this important sector. And the answer is an affirmation to this important role that we all play. In responding to some of the questions that I was asked to address, I look at what Steiner and Halston say, that civil society contributes significantly, 1, to setting standards, 2, promotion, implementation, and 3, enforcement of human rights. I see civil society organizations intervening along this path, with some organizations established to set standards, to promote rights, to provide direct services, or monitoring how these services are provided and how these rights are realized or not. In most instances, organizations will undertake a number of these thematic areas. We see interactions at community level where, in most cases, services are provided directly. However, particularly with social protection and specifically with cash transfers, which is most of what we do, we see a top-down approach where programs are designed centrally by the central government, and then services are provided at the community level. What happens is that the levels of awareness of rights, levels of awareness of these programs at community level remain very low, and nobody knows who deserves to be on a government program. What are the parameters of getting onto a government program? Therefore, civil society organizations must raise awareness on rights. They must raise awareness on government programs that are being provided at community level. We should not assume that because it's a government-led program, every citizen understands or every citizen knows. Civil society also have a role to monitor what the government is doing, how the government is providing this service. For cash transfers, for example, in African context, it targets the poorest of the poor. And you know what it means to provide services to a poor person. They don't have any voice. So civil society must strengthen the voice of the poor, the marginalized, the excluded, to claim their rights. Even though cash transfers are targeted to the poor, we should be very careful that it should not be a service, a poor service. Even though it is targeting the poor, it should not be a poor service. We also see interactions at national level where we have different civil society organizations engaging on the policy and legal interventions. This is often a tedious and long process, sometimes with results, sometimes without. Civil society organizations that are working on constitution review processes and other legal processes at national level know the pain of engaging in legal and policy advocacy. It can even span 20 years, like in the Kenya situation where the constitution review process took over 20 years. So when you're given a cycle of grant by a donor, who expects results in 5 years? It becomes unnecessary pressure for the civil society organization because it's beyond your control to make sure that the constitution is passed in 5 years or a law is passed within a specific year. And we are seeing the grants that we are getting are becoming smaller and reduced. You know, you even have grants for 6 months, grants for 2 years, grants for 1 year. So you're always like chasing this dream that does not happen. So I think my message to our partners is that let's be realistic in terms of expectations with what we can do. But you know, such long processes is where really the change is, because once these rights are enshrined in a constitution, then you know that it is there for sustainability. Another interaction is the negotiation process that we see at the global or regional agenda, including the SDGs or the MDGs that were there, or the 2063 agenda of the Africa Union, for example. There's always a disconnect between the resources and the time we spend in coming up with these frameworks and raising awareness on these frameworks when they are passed. I remember when the SDGs were coming to an end in 2015, there are communities in Kenya who had never heard of what MDGs are. So the resources and the time we spend in building these frameworks, we should, include the same resources. We should devote the same resources to raise awareness to the citizen in very distant places to make sure that they also understand and know what is happening at the global level. Just an answer to Daniela. I think for civil society organizations, what we have seen is evidence-based advocacy works. We need to strengthen communities to come up with data and information that can inform policy. We need to build the capacity of communities to respond, to bring this data up to policymakers. Being in New York this week, I have seen Amazon trying to, stopping the idea of setting up a headquarters in New York. And that is because of community action. I mean, one aspect of it is communities are resisting it. And I think when our communities are able to stand up for their rights, that's when we know that civil society, we have made a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Mudora, for highlighting the role of civil society at all levels, from the local to the global. I would like to thank each of our speakers of this morning panel for the very rich contribution they made and for really setting the tone of today's discussion. We will now take a few minutes to rearrange the panel and call our keynote speaker of the day, Professor Philip Halston. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to resume. Please take your seats. Thank you so much. So we have the pleasure to have Professor Halston with us today as the keynote speaker. I guess that most of you are already familiar with his work, but I will still go ahead and present him. Mr. Halston was appointed United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights in June 2014 by the Human Rights Council. He's also the John Norton Pomeroy Professor of Law at NYU School of Law. Professor Halston served the United Nations in various capacities, such as the first rapporteur of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, a committee that he then chaired for 8 years. During this period, he played a central role in efforts to reform and streamline the UN treaty body system. And as an independent expert appointed by the UN Secretary General, he reported to the General Assembly on measures to ensure the long-term effectiveness of the UN human rights treaty bodies. He also served as a special advisor to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the MDGs and as a special rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary execution. Professor Halston, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Monica. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning. This is an extremely important gathering, and I want to talk about some of the issues that are before you as I see them from my perspective as UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. What is really attractive about the focus of your efforts today and at the forthcoming session of CSW is the emphasis on inequality, on fiscal policy, wage policy, and social protection. I suspect that for some of you at least, that list of issues will be intimidating, boring, not what you're interested in, and issues that should be dealt with elsewhere. That's certainly the fairly long experience that I've had in the human rights area, where there is a resistance to having to deal with issues like fiscal policy and the more technical aspects of social protection policy. But the truth, or the reality that we are being reminded of more and more every day is that in fact the policies that we really care about in terms of the rights of women, in terms of human rights more broadly, are being fundamentally determined by the way in which economic policies are evolving around the globe. We are seeing, in fact, the triumph of neoliberal policy prescriptions. I'm not saying that in a political sense, believe it or not. I'm saying it simply as a description of what's happening. Taxes are being cut in the vast majority of countries, and governments are under great pressure. The result is that governments become less relevant, less interested, and less able to respond to the sorts of agendas that are before this group. Privatization becomes the only option on the table because, let's face it, governments can't do it, and in any event, they are inefficient. So let's turn to the private sector. Deregulation becomes important because we need to make a more attractive environment for business. All of these policies are problematic in a range of ways if the starting point is how do we protect and promote the rights of women, and in terms of my own particular concern, how do we protect the least well-off in all of our societies, those who are living in poverty or those who are very close to it, which is a much higher number. It goes, I think, without saying, but there is actually a very good report for those of you who might not have come across it, by a colleague of mine named Juan Pablo Bohovslavsky, who submitted a report to the General Assembly last year in his capacity as Special Rapporteur on foreign debt. And it looks at the implications, at the gender implications of austerity policies. Austerity policies are almost inherently hostile to women. That's a controversial statement. Let me give you a couple of examples. In my role as Special Rapporteur, I made 2 country visits last year. One was to Ghana in the early part of the year, and the other was to the United Kingdom in the second part of the year. In Ghana, you have one of the fastest growing economies in the world. You have one of Africa's great success stories. You also have a very determined neoliberal policy approach whereby the government sees its role essentially as facilitating business and trying to encourage private entities to invest. Very little money is given to social protection measures, very little by any measure. Ghana has one of the world's highest rates of child marriage. Well over a quarter of girls are married by the age of 18. And we know the very direct links between early marriage and poverty and exclusion. Women occupy 11% of the seats in Parliament. Women take up only 30% of tertiary enrolments. And in the very important national and regional councils of chiefs, the traditional bodies, you can guess how many women there are. I had a very revealing conversation with the person responsible for the Council of Chiefs and asked, had there ever been a woman? And he scratched his head and said, yes, I think, yes, there was one. I'm not sure if there still is. Anyway, it's not important. And I said, well, it would be interesting to know, at which point the only woman in the room, probably as a political gesture, said, well, I'll go and check. And she came back and said, no, there's no woman on any of the councils of chiefs. I then visited the United Kingdom and looked at a range of issues, but what's the dominant theme in terms of my visit, at least in the United Kingdom, was the impact of policies that go under the heading of austerity, which the United Kingdom has been pursuing vigorously since 2010. It has meant, for example, cutting back on money for local government by 50%. It has meant the virtual closing down of some local and county councils, the ones that used to provide the real fallback, the real safety net for those in need. And at the end of my visit, after I had discussed a lot of the very technical details of what's called universal credit, which is 6 different programs rolled into one, I was asked at a press conference whether there was a differential impact on women of these policies. And I was caught a little bit off guard because I hadn't actually said as much as I should have in my report on that particular issue. And so how I responded was to say that if you were to gather in a room a group of misogynists and asked them to design a welfare policy, they probably wouldn't make many changes to the one that is currently in place. Now, this is, of course, not peculiar to the United Kingdom. We know that in almost every country, the people who are poorest, the people who are worst off, the people who are under the greatest pressure are single mothers. Single mothers are subject to the moralistic response of male-dominated governments that they shouldn't have had the baby in the first place. And if they've chosen to go down that road, then they're not going to have an easy time. And so governments around the world are busily introducing, even today, ever more punitive policies designed to force single mothers, even with very young babies, out to work, to make it very difficult for them to get the sort of benefits that are otherwise available. And what we see more generally is that policies of austerity are, as I said earlier, often simply anti-woman. In the United States, for example, which I visited a year previously, what we've seen is a very consistent cutback in the budgets at the local, the county, and the state levels. When legislators debate these sort of cutbacks, the local government will provide fewer services for the elderly, fewer services for children in need. Police will be less available to do certain things. You know what's going to happen. People don't just die because they're being neglected. Women are given a bigger burden. It's simply transferred. The state can no longer do it. Someone has to pick it up, and of course, it can't be men, because men don't do the caring in most of those situations. And so the austerity policies are a very convenient way of just shifting an even greater burden onto the shoulders of women. The reason I go into these examples is, first of all, we need to know that the issues affect all countries. Secondly, we need to bring alive the extent to which what goes under the boring rubric of fiscal policy or austerity policy actually has very direct and important social consequences for everyone, certainly for poor people and particularly for women. Let me then make a few comments based on the types of issues that have been addressed in the draft document that I've been looking at for the CSW declaration at the end of its next session. And let me say, first of all, that I come at these issues, of course, from a human rights perspective. But human rights are out of fashion. Human rights are generally referred to these days in a fairly tokenistic way, just like women used to be. You've got a list of issues that you've got to tick off. You've got a long statement and you have to make sure human rights is in there. But the reason that this is deeply problematic is that unless there is a genuine commitment to rights, including particularly the rights of women, there is no philosophical grounding which enables us to push back against the policies of neoliberalism, which are transforming not just our economies, but our basic societies. Who can say whether one set of economic policies or another is better? You can only make that assessment meaningfully if you have a starting point which is shared and which spells out very clearly the relevant values. And that starting point in our world has to be human rights. But we forget that very often, and we see many countries, many governments, consistently trying to strip out references to human rights in all sorts of different contexts. We see, for example, as I've written about at great length, the World Bank won't use the term human rights. The World Bank explained to me, well, we're not sorry, we can't really engage with human rights because they're political. But of course, we're not. Everything we do is not political. But human rights, sorry, can't do it. When I asked the Deputy Legal Counsel at the International Monetary Fund, are human rights relevant to you? And he thinks for a moment and then says, well, yes, I suppose genocide. That's great. So the IMF won't actually accept funding for a genocide. That might be bad news for some governments, but that's it. That's the human rights policy. So in the sort of forums where these policies are really being made, fiscal policies, financial, economic priorities being set, human rights are absent. And that's something that we really need to work to try to change. I want to mention just a couple of other issues. I don't want to push the timetable back too far. First of all, we continue to see that fiscal policy is debated and determined at the national and, for the most part, international levels in complete isolation from the sort of issues that this group is looking at. You can make all the statements you like about the importance of fiscal policy, taking account of the interests of women, being gender-friendly, being human rights-friendly, and so on. Those arguments, those perspectives are not reflected in most fiscal policy debates. It's partly our fault. It's partly because we are not there insisting that when you, the government, the finance ministry, etc., are debating these policies, there needs to be someone to speak up for gender-friendly policies for human rights more broadly. Instead, what I see when I visit different countries and the finance minister waxes lyrical about some new social protection program that the World Bank or the IMF is promoting, the only thing that he is seeing, and I mean he, finance much too important to leave to women in almost any country, it seems, the only thing that he's seeing is major cost savings. That's where social protection reform is important, because money can be saved. We don't need to be spending it on these poor people. We can, with the support of the bank and the fund, introduce ever more narrow targeting, which we know has the major effect of reducing even further the sort of community support for any sort of real social protection policies. Because if you target it far enough, you get down to a really hard core of maybe 10% of the population about whom no one cares. They're the outcasts. They're not the people for whom policy is made. And so it's only a social protection policy which is more broad-based that's going to get the sort of support that is essential, and that is reflected in the CSW type emphasis on the importance of social protection generally. Austerity is a word that comes up, and I've mentioned it already. I think for me, and certainly the strong conclusion I came away from the United Kingdom with, the term austerity is presented as a financial approach. It's something that only comes up when countries are really strapped for money and there are no real alternatives. Well, my friends, It's changed. Austerity is now closer to an ideology. Austerity is a way of justifying neoliberal policies that want to constantly cut back on government budgets. And that leads me to the next issue, which is dealt with in a fairly gentle way in the CSW draft that I've seen, and that is privatization. Sorry, CSD, I'm sorry. Which is, I'm not good with my acronyms. It takes me to the issue of privatization. I presented a report to the General Assembly a few months ago on the issue of privatization. And I have to confess that it's a subject that I hadn't really pursued myself in any detail in the past. In the human rights area, what we have tended to say is, well, privatization is neither good nor bad. It doesn't really matter if something is run by the government or by a private actor. What counts is that human rights are respected and that there remains accountability. That's fine as a basic proposition. The only problem is that when you look much more closely at a very large percentage of cases where privatization has occurred, neither of those last two qualifications is met. Human rights have not been protected, and accountability has not been maintained. So what governments often do is to say, no, we're transferring responsibility for this function, and it could be water, it could be electricity, it could be prisons, might be social protection, might even be child welfare. We're transferring it to a private entity, or it's going to be a public-private partnership. But make no mistake, we will insist that human rights are respected in this process. Well, I'm sorry, my friends. Corporations are not set up and never will be set up to take account of human rights, of people with disabilities, of people living in poverty, of people who are not in the economic mainstream. Those people are trouble. They are nuisances. They are not going to be a real focus of corporate actors. And I don't even criticize the corporations for that in a way. Probably if I was running a company, I would do something similar. I would say it's not for me to look after the losers in society. That's for the government. But what's happening is the government is washing its hands of this and saying, no, child protection or social protection or education is now being dealt with by private actors, and we no longer have a substantive role. That's a total disaster for a very significant percentage of the population, for people who live in rural areas, for people who live in slums, which are never going to be attractive places to do business for the most part, and for a variety of others. And I think what we need to do is to start questioning much more significantly the rush towards so-called public-private partnerships. As you probably know, the World Bank has adopted a policy, one of the many wonderful things given to the bank by the departing president, Jim Kim, which essentially says that it should only fund governments to do anything if there can be a showing that the private sector can't do it. So the sort of default policy is that ideally the private sector should do it. So again, and I'll finish on this note, when I was in the United Kingdom, I met with a marvelous body that should exist in every country called the National Audit Office. Sounds boring, right? And indeed made up of accountants and other such dull people. And they do absolutely superb work. looking at the economic and societal impact of a whole range of major economic policies. In the most recent study that they did of privatization, and remember the United Kingdom was the pioneer, Margaret Thatcher was one of the leaders of the whole movement to privatize as much as possible of the British economy. The National Audit Office concluded that the private sector is more expensive and less efficient in providing hospitals, schools, and other public infrastructure. In other words, what's needed is actually a rational analysis of whether a particular issue or sector should be opened up to private enterprise or should be devolved through public-private partnerships. There will certainly be cases where it should happen, where the private sector can do a better job. But that will not always be the case. And what does need to happen is to make sure that the government retains the essential responsibility to address significantly and substantively what is left behind. So if you privatize forms of health protection, health provision, you have to make sure that those who are clearly not going to benefit from the privatized services are being taken care of through other means for which the government must be responsible. But when I look at the sort of documentation that is being prepared for CSD, I see fairly banal references to privatization linked to participation and accountability, but it needs to be a much more critical approach, and we need to push back against what I see as a sort of tsunami of PPP proposals that are coming up in all sorts of different contexts. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Halston, for giving us the bigger political picture in which the social protection systems and other systems operate, and for highlighting the disastrous effects they have on women and all vulnerable groups. I hope this message will also encourage many more of us to look into fiscal policies and their effects. We will now go to the next section, which is the interactive panel discussion. I will hand over to Daniel Perrell, who is the chair of the Executive Committee of the NGO Committee for Social Development. Thank you so much.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, friends. The gavel's over there. No. So, good morning, everybody. Yes, this is a civil society forum, so you're allowed to interact. So, good morning, everybody. There we go. So, first, let me start just by thanking Professor Philip Halston for his very courageous analysis. It's not easy to say some of these things so explicitly, so openly in this house. And we're very grateful to him for the reports he writes, the voice he brings, and the really credible analysis that he has. So thank you so much to him for that and for his remarks. Also, of course, thank you to the opening panel. It's wonderful to have DESA DISD's support, the support of the chair of the commission, and all of you, Frederick Ebert Stiftung, of course, and then all of you who have come this morning. And I note that this is as full as the House has been all week, with the exception of the first morning. So I think this is really saying something. I want to start this panel with a couple of framing remarks, and then I will let my colleagues take the floor. And there are two things that came to my mind as I was listening to the remarks this morning, two analogies. And you have probably all heard me say this before, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. But the first is the blind man and the elephant. This idea that if you have individuals who are visually impaired approach an elephant and try to describe it, they may each approach it differently. Some may say it is stringy, some may say it is rough, some may say it is smooth. None of them are wrong. They're all describing the same thing. And I think that's important when we're talking about diagnosing the problems we're seeing in the world. Too often we become entrenched in our own perspective and think, no, the elephant is a solid, smooth piece of ivory. But that's just one part. That's one analogy. The second is the analogy of the human body, in which we are all interrelated and interconnected, and the advancement of one means the advancement of all. And likewise, when one is harmed, it inhibits the performance of all. And this one is more about diagnosis to me. When we're analyzing this elephant, we're also trying to assess what can be done. And now I think there are three levels of analysis that I've heard in this room. The first one is the level of the symptom. So I'm going to actually take this not just to any human body, but my father's, may he rest in peace. My father died of pancreatic cancer. So he had some symptoms. He had trouble eating. He had trouble walking. He was very weak. We treated those. We thought about a feeding tube. We thought about, assistance to help him walk. So the symptoms. But nobody gets over cancer by treating the symptoms. The second was the disease itself. So we tried to treat that disease. But, of course, pancreatic cancer almost always wins. And you try with various forms of medications and things of this nature. But then the third is the underlying causes. My father did not happen upon pancreatic cancer. He was a smoker. He was diabetic. He did not take care of his body. And that was why he got pancreatic cancer. Those three levels are all distinct when we're talking about treating a problem that we're seeing in the world. The symptoms that we see today are extreme poverty, extreme inequality, and we say, let's raise the condition of the poor. Many of us are tired of this argument because it's like giving a feeding tube to a dying man. The second one is the disease itself. Let's address wealth, corporate capture, privatization. These things are real, and this is the conversation that Professor Halston has laid out for us. And this is really vital, and I think this is the next level of what we're trying to do. But the third level, and this is where I think civil society has something really profound to offer. The third level is, what are the actual underlying causes? Humanity, as a body, is smoking. It is diabetic. And treating extreme wealth and corporate capture, that will do something. But we also have to talk about the moral compass, the values, the aspiration. Only by talking about these things and this leads to political will, by talking about these, will we get to true human flourishing and global prosperity. And we have to address this at all three levels, and we have to look at the elephant as a whole. So with that, we've done our best with this panel to have people who are situated at different parts of the spectrum of looking at the elephant, so they can assess some of the problems. But I've also asked them to provide some of the solutions, some of the proactive things that they have done that are not just treating the symptoms or even the disease, but also the underlying causes. And I'm really excited to hear from them. I will do my best to limit them all to roughly 5 minutes so that this actually becomes truly interactive. And then I really am looking forward to the perspectives that all of you have, because really any 6 or 7 of us could be 6 or 7 of you. We know that you have quite a richness in experience and something of high quality to bring in. So we'll start with my friend here, Enemona Adaji. You may know that I'm terrible at giving biographies. For this, I'm grateful to all those who made this, because his biography can be found on page 10. But to sum it up, he's trying to do as much as he can in innovative and new and creative ways to really treat many of the problems that humanity is facing, from bringing light to those who are in darkness, from bringing voices to those who are outside of the education system. He's based in Nigeria and the UK, and I'm really looking forward to him, as I think you all should be too. Mr. Adaji, you have the floor.
Thank you for having me here today. Panelists, you're welcome. Everyone here, you're welcome. I can see the floor is full today. I'll try not to disappoint you, but everything I have, like most things I have to say, have been said during the week. However, there are people who are here today for the first time, so I'll still try as much as I can to carry everyone along. So Daniel asked me to kind of talk about the general problems we face in the system and talk about solutions I think can help build on in the system. So basically, first of all, I attended the forum here 3 years ago, and I made a comment about we NGOs and civil society, how we work in silos. And 3 years on, I haven't really seen much change in the system because, you know, we all have different aspects or challenges we want to focus on in different regions across the world. And I can tell you that in the room here today, you know, there are many NGOs or civil societies working on similar projects, but we don't work together. Everyone works on individual projects, and we all have a common goal. So why don't we kind of work together to achieve that common goal, because we are not in competition with each other. The second thing that struck me is the fact that, you know, when we talk about interventions, most of all our interventions are project-based. They are all like, it all has like a start date and a finish date, and it doesn't really like solve the main problems as to why the need arose in the first place. And most times interventions are created for target communities without the input of the community themselves, which we want to help. So I was privileged, I think at the beginning of the year, last year, I was in charge of a group of young students, like a group of youths, the Liter of Light Nigeria. We went to impoverished communities in Nigeria, especially in Lagos. People were surprised when I say impoverished communities in Lagos, because Lagos is the economic hub of Nigeria. But the inequality there is kind of like the difference between two worlds in one city. So the approach we took, you know, we kind of involved the locals from the beginning of the project to actually build the project. And I think the locals kind of took the project and they made it theirs, because the whole idea is to teach them how to use everyday materials that can be sourced locally to build solar lights, most especially street lights. And an example is, you know, when we were on the drawing board putting the project together, we were thinking of ways to make it more sustainable and for it to last long, and we're thinking of using metal poles. But when we came to the community and we're having a discussion with them, they kind of wanted us to use bamboo sticks because it kind of fit into their communities, and to them it was more sustainable. So we had to take that on board, and we built the street lights with them, and they chose the places on the island that it meant like it was important we install these lights to them, like school areas, close to the primary health center, and they kind of owned it. And to my greatest surprise, I'm no disrespect to any woman in the room, but the mothers and the young girls were kind of the ones who brought the project together when it came to putting the lights together and installing these street lights, which kind of struck me hard, because the guys in the communities were kind of lazing around and running away when it came to do the hard work in the community. So that's a personal experience which got to me anyway. So I think I have 5 minutes, so let me try as much as I can to summarize my talk. But across the different side events during the week, common themes came out to me. So, I criticize, project-based approaches, but, short-term interventions are not a waste of time, but, they address the urgent needs, which Daniel just mentioned, the symptoms. But long-term interventions should be used to address the causes and to help build systems in these communities that, we are all worried about. So across all organizations and work, we want to create real impact, and we're trying to build a world which we'll be proud of. But there are three things we shouldn't downplay, which is humility, first of all, and we should try to build trust between ourselves and the community. That's not something that can happen overnight or can be rushed. Trust has to be built, naturally between us and the communities we want to work with. And also, in our day, in the projects or the work we do, we should try to build unity as well, because long-term change can only work if there's trust, unity, and humility. And we should be ready to dialogue with the community to have a long-term vision, which, if you have a long-term vision with the community, you are indirectly creating awareness with the community for them to actually believe in the project, in the long term, what you are trying to solve. When all these things are done, I think if the resources are there, resources are limited generally, but if these resources are there and there's trust with the community, there's unity amongst those who are implementing and those who are receiving, this help, this community we are trying to help, it kind of helps us to manage these resources in a more sustainable manner, and it will go a long way. So even after the projects or after the implementation phase, the project will still carry on without us being there. So that's what I have to say in 5 minutes. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adaji. We'll now turn to Mr. Garrido, who is the Executive Director of District Council 37. I must confess, for my part, I do not know enough about unions, about wage negotiations and collective bargaining. Maybe all of you are far more knowledgeable on these issues, and I hope you are, but I hope that Henry can help us understand a little bit better some of these concerns that are facing the populations he works with. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Henry Garrido. I'm the Executive Director of District Council 37, which is the largest municipal union here in New York City. I also am the Vice President of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, which is one of the largest labor union organizations in the United States, nationally representing over 1.5 million workers. That includes workers like police officers, sanitation, EMTs, teachers in all manners of respect of municipal government and also private industry, but primarily on the public sector, on the government side. not federal employees like the one we saw in the shutdown, but those who provide services and work for the general public. Here in New York, anyone from, I would like to say, from an architect to a zookeeper is represented by the union. I am now the executive director. And I want to take a moment to talk about labor unions and to make the case for labor unions as the biggest antidote for income inequality in this country. Not the only one, but one of the ones who had demonstrated throughout the years and with evidence that it has been the biggest combatant in income inequality, because it has demonstrated not only the early discussions regarding pay inequality for women and people of color, but has had the ability to raise wages, working conditions, retirement security, and access to good health insurance and throughout the country. So on the one hand, the labor unions are fighting against those austerity measures we heard here before, which are quite common across the country. Municipalities' resources go down, tax revenues down, much because of policies of the very same governments are creating. Deregulation is rampant. Tax breaks for the wealthy are continuing to starve much needed resources from municipalities, which often leads to the call for more tax on the bottom tier and then ultimately to propose privatization of ownership of major assets that produce income and resources to the private tiers like water and roads and schools, which also affect the people I represent, creating this very vicious cycle where you starve government, you starve municipalities of resources, you then call for an emergency of austerity because you've already starved that, and then you begin to deregulate, you begin to cut labor protections, you begin to eliminate collective bargaining as a way of getting more and more away from the workers, pressing down wages, pressing down the working conditions and throughout the world and throughout the United States. And we've seen this in the United States quite often with the Supreme Court challenges to existing rules that were set way back in the 1950s and 60s in the United States. In states like Wisconsin, where they stripped away collective bargaining for workers, which led to an increase in poverty, an increase of access to health insurance, an increase to application for public assistance, and many other diminutions of services of working people. But I want to get to another side that often doesn't get talked about in labor, which I think is really critical for the very discussions that we have had this week, which is, don't just think of labor as a representative for workers. Labor also sits as a major investment to the very same thing that are threatened to undermine the very foundation of civil society. Public sector unions, for instance, are investing $20 trillion of their pensions of the very workers they represent throughout the world. I am one of those trustees to sit across the United States with one of the largest pension systems here. We invest about $200 billion worth of work. I also sit in other pension systems nationally that have equal value. So about 11 trillion of those are public sector funds that are coming from the workers' salaries and paychecks that are being used to undermine in other countries and reduce wages and privatize water systems and privatize schools and privatize universities, and then demand as part of that process a diminution of the same conditions that we're fighting here in the United States. So this incredible contrast and irony, quite frankly, that for us in labor, we have not been keeping an eye on that. And when I became a trustee upon election, I began to look at, for instance, what is the role of hedge funds throughout the world in creating and forcing not just the neoliberal visions that we saw, but actually accentuating and buying collateralized debt from poor countries, of countries that were economically distressed, and then demanding wage diminutions and demanding a number of austerity measures that were cutting the workers and people, and then had the audacity when we questioned, well, what are your labor standards? How are you treating women on your boards? How are you paying people? To have the audacity to say, what do you mean? We're here to make you money. And I often see it as a trustee on that, as many other trustees. And we've been pushing back, and I'm proud to say New York City Pension's the first one to divest from hedge funds. We are now divesting from fossil fuels. We are now divesting from private prisons that are demanding quotas for immigration and for people of color being incarcerated. And we're doing it on a fiduciary responsibility, getting a greater return, and also reinvesting that money that we're pulling out into good, sustainable green jobs, into higher paying jobs with good labor standards. So collectively, we can do more, but we have to have conversations beyond our individual bubbles, as you said, beyond unions talking to other unions, but talk to more organizations and organizations talking to us if we're going to make a major change in what is happening in society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garrido. I think you actually gave a wonderful example of that third level of change, which is beyond just treating the symptom or the disease, but you're getting to some of those causes. I'm really grateful to you for your work and to have heard you this morning. I will now turn to Professor Chomtolihuk. She'll pronounce it correctly when she has the floor, I'm sure. She is a professor at the CUNY School of Law. She does a lot on the rights, particularly of workers in New York City. She's devoted her professional career to public service, and I will admit it will be very hard for me to limit her remarks because my legal history could have very well sent me along a path that she blazed far better than I ever could have. So please, you have the floor.
So first I want to thank Henry because as a law professor, I'm actually a member of PSC CUNY, and my pension is vested. So I want to thank him for that work. I also want to thank Monica for inviting me. I think this is probably the first time I've been on a panel, so I'm older, but I'm a newbie. And I think it's because of the centralization of grassroots, because most of my work has not been here. My site of advocacy has not been here. And it's really beautiful to see each of you here today. And to thank Daniel as well for inviting me to speak specifically about my work here around low-waged workers. But also, I have this sort of unique vantage point of looking at garment workers and tea workers in Bangladesh. So trying to give sort of a transnational grassroots frame, worker to worker, what would be some solutions. I also took to heart, whenever I'm invited, I do come, as today, and the sister in the earlier panel invited us for solutions. 5 minutes is not enough, so I would love to talk to you offline. I have lots of solutions and ideas, and mostly from the phenomenal grassroots civil society community. I think that's really where the innovation is going to happen. And so I think that sort of using that invitation, I wanted to give some framing because, again, 5 minutes is not going to be enough, and I'm going to focus predominantly on some legal strategies with the caveat that law in isolation without a robust community organizing and grassroots mobilization will never be an effective legal strategy. And so I think whenever I talk about legal solutions, I want you to bear in mind that it has to be hand in hand an active partnership with civil society and grassroots mobilization. So a couple of themes that I think, for me, that's really important so that's transparent about values and missions and where do I come from. So I want to lay those out first, and I hope that those then can help for our interactive panel. So first and foremost, center those who are most impacted. I think this was coming up in Philip Alston's talk around who is most impacted, speak to them. They have the solutions. That is a fundamental principle in any design solution sort of premise. Support grassroots collective formations, whether they're unions or in the United States, there's been the development of worker centers. So there are very innovative and different formations that have emerged that we need to really support and look at those organizations. The other sort of framing that I want to sort of lay out is to support radical, innovative approaches. And when I talk about radical, I'm using it in the sense of getting to the root cause. Why is this happening? And I think Danielle also alluded to that. Not just the symptoms, but what's sort of underlying the issues of inequality. When I talk about innovation, it always comes up, you Google, it's like, Columbia Business School or Harvard Business Review. I'm not talking about innovation from a corporatized sense. I'm talking about innovation with the innate human ability to be creative. We are fundamentally and beautiful creative beings, and when I talk about innovation, I'm talking about from that space. And then the last two things about value alignment. What is it really that we care about? What are we really fighting for? Our work has to be mission-driven. And I think that's also, we sort of talked about and heard that a little bit today. Do we really believe in human rights? I'm not yet ready to discard the term. When I ask you that question, what I'm asking is, do you really believe that an individual has a fundamental right to exist and to be without necessarily having to show their proof of their worth, their value, or any other contribution to society? And I think when we get to the point that a human being can just be and exist and live with dignity, then and then only can we have human rights. So when I talk about human rights, it's without any but or any condition. And the last thing, sort of in honor of Black feminist Crenshaw, intersectionality, and Brother Adachi has already talked about it. When we talk about inequality, I'm talking about race, class, gender, disability, and all of these issues that constitutes and configures the inequality that we see today. So that's a lot, but I think those have to anchor whatever solutions that we're thinking about. So the two, and you're going to give me some time, right? So the two things I wanted to focus on is laws. What are the laws that exist? Enforce them, and enforce them with vigor. And I think that we're seeing repeatedly in the wage context that, just to give you some context, $8 billion annually is stolen from workers. This is called wage theft. Through non-payment of minimum wages, through administrative agencies and courts that are unable to enforce the laws regarding minimum wage laws. This is, I think, nationally, it's about $50 billion that are stolen from workers, and it is happening in plain sight. Just to give a comparison from the Economic Policy Institute, robbery happens of $14 billion. Wage theft is $50 billion, just to put that into perspective. Young workers, women, people of color, and it's been mentioned before, are more likely to be vulnerable to wage theft and to minimum wage violations. In the garment sector in Bangladesh, I think if you're reading the news, you know that 11,000 workers were fired, and they were fired because they were protesting the wage inequalities. So enforce the law. What are the law gaps? The law gaps that exist in our society is all the things that were mentioned before. One great solution is New York City passed a minimum wage law for app drivers that Uber, Lyft, and Juno are fighting. And I think we need to sort of counter their fight. This provides minimum wage and guaranteed income to the predominantly immigrant workforce in New York City. We need to challenge gender-based violence in the garment and the supply chain. So these are the law gaps that we need to look at. Now I can go more in detail, but in the interest of 1 minute. The last two points I really want to emphasize is corporate accountability. And I think the brother Henry mentioned about reshifting our investment priorities, holding corporations accountable, legally accountable. There are treaties now that are being in discussion about holding corporations liable for human rights violations, but we need to really lift up those conversations. This has been true in 2013 post-Rana Plaza. Even though there's been such a tragedy of 1,100 workers dying, the material conditions of garment workers in Bangladesh has not changed since 5 years. It's actually getting worse. And so corporate accountability. And then the last point that I wanted to kind of make, which I think I've arrived at years of both legal and then also political organizing, is we need a narrative cultural shift. We need to rethink how are we thinking about human rights and inequality. We need to push back, and I think this was mentioned earlier, the idea that corporations are the best arbiters of social policy. They are not. We now have evidence that shows that they are not. And I think we need to really stand firm and push back on that sort of narrative. That is the function of civil society, of governments, of educators. Arts and cultures and artists are best suited to do that. We should support artists. Next time, I hope there's an artist, not only just a lawyer, on a panel, because cultural shifts are critical to bring about changes around inequality. So I think I'll stop there, but those are sort of some of the ways that we can think about law changes, narrative shifts, and hold corporations to account for human rights violations and global inequality.
Thank you very much. So there's often a challenge that I see even in our discourse about what I call guilt by association. We all know this term, but it happens even when we're trying to pursue justice, and we have to be very careful. This is why we ensure that there's always somebody who works in the private sector who joins us on these panels, because while we talk about the private sector this and corporate capture that, we have to recognize that this is a nuanced thing. Private business around the world is doing wonderful things to advance human well-being, and so we should not just ascribe to all in the private sector some form of guilt because of how others may be acting. And so with that, I'm very happy to welcome Paul Katipan here. He's president and CEO of NetPro Communications, and he's a member of the Commission of New Humanities Economic Communion Project and the Focalaire movement. So we look forward to hearing from you, Paul. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dan. I'm both humbled and honored to be part of this panel. And I'd like to present to you, this morning we talked about what's happening in the laboratories. So I wanted to share what I've seen in the private sector. And to that effect, I want to talk about an economy of communion business, another model in the private sector. In the economy of communion, or I call it EOC to make it short, entrepreneurs, workers, directors, consumers, scholars, the poor, and families all work together to eradicate poverty. It was launched by Chiara Lubich, the founder of the Focalaire movement and New Humanity, in May of 1991 in the slums of São Paulo, Brazil. It aims to promote a culture of reciprocal giving and social justice through businesses animated with the values of universal brotherhood. Starting with a few dozen businesses that joined in 1991, today about 800 businesses of various sizes are part of this project throughout the world. During these years, the EOC project has been the object of academic research, including 300 theses for undergraduate and graduate degrees in different disciplines in many parts of the world. Members of the EOC commit themselves to living the values of a culture of giving and reciprocity. They consider the business as a place or instrument to reduce poverty and injustice. EOC businesses provide jobs to the local communities, offering employments also to those who find it difficult to find a job due to their past histories or lack of resources. For prospective entrepreneurs, they offer direct financial assistance, seminars on financial management, technical assistance, and skills training. Mature EOC businesses bring prospective entrepreneurs from developing regions and embed them in their businesses for hands-on training. They also offer internships to the youth. EOC businesses and donors have established foundations that provide seed money to startups in impoverished areas around the world. Through seminars and lectures such as this, they invite others to participate in the EOC in various creative ways. The EOC business and members work to assist people in living in vulnerable economic conditions to find a more dignified, secure, and self-fulfilling life. But how does it work? So the entrepreneur comes to see that the need offered to them by the one in need is a real gift and brings into perspective the real meaning and value of work. At the same time, those in need come to experience a new fraternity and a sense of belonging to a family where everyone gives and receives. So every form of poverty presented has its wealth and values that allow everyone to experience how important we all are to each other's happiness and fulfillment. So with this reciprocity established, there are no longer poor or rich people, but only people who have gifts to give to each other. One of these businesses is the company that I started here in New York City 9 years ago, called Nepro Communications. We are a system security integration company with our clients primarily from the transportation world, such as the MTA, the Metro North, Long Island Railroad, the Amtrak. We also partner with other security integrator companies in providing technical services to the transportation industry. We design, configure, test, and commission security systems such as the surveillance cameras, intrusion detection systems, and network security. From the start of my company, I tried to follow the principles of EOC and its focus on relationships and reciprocity. If you remember in 2012, in the recession, I hired a few people who had a hard time finding employment. There was Jeff, who was a marketing manager. There was Joe, who was just barely an electrical apprentice. And Sandra, a recent college graduate who majored in English. Bringing into a high technical company, I said, how will I bring them in? And yet, once given the opportunity, they blossomed and provided creative ways in contributing to my company in ways that I did not think of. And more importantly, as they blossomed and reached their potential, my clients noticed them, and they were approached by them. And usually in a company, you would like to hoard your employees. But again, what is best for them is best for me and best for the companies and my clients. So I encourage them to take employment with my clients. Little would I know that they would become my best-selling marketing agents. As they were working with my clients, they would bring in work back to me. So what does the EOC have to offer in terms of an effective strategy to help eliminate the root causes of poverty in this world? I would like to just focus on 3 aspects. First, the EOC is a real operating sustainable model. It has 25 years of experience impacting hundreds of local communities worldwide. Although still small compared to the world's economic system, its vision can easily be replicated by others with similar difficulties. 2, the EOC focuses on engaging those in need with the solutions to their own challenges. Productive inclusion in real companies that rebuilds relationships, encourages self-confidence and direction, and revitalizes the meaning of work for all. And 3rd, the EOC encourages a new shared culture of giving, connecting the planet with fraternal relationships based on reciprocity, seeing the others as not merely people to help, but our brothers and sisters who needs our help, but also can help us. In short, the economy of communion touches on the individual's intrinsic question of purpose and promotes a culture of giving by sharing their resources and talents to a fraternal society. To conclude, I would like to quote Kiara Lubick when she started this EOC during her visit in 1991. And she says, "Unlike a consumer economy based on a culture of having, the EOC is based on the culture of giving. This might seem to be difficult, ambitious, heroic, but it is not so, because human beings find their fulfillment in loving and in giving." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think that is a wonderful example of a different perspective on the nature and purpose of work. And we're very grateful to you for your good work and wish you all the best as you continue on. I now have the great pleasure of giving the floor to Mr. Amson Sibanda. He's a longtime friend of the NGO committee. He is very involved, of course, within the DESA DISD division. He leads and manages the activities undertaken by his team that supports the implementation of the social pillar of the 2030 Agenda. And I would be very curious to hear what you've heard, what has stood out to you thus far, and what is sort of cause for hope and optimism. Amson, you have the floor.
Thanks, Dan, and the NGO committee for inviting us to this important forum. I think there are so many takeaways from this week. The passion that member states have, civil society have, when it comes to issues of injustice, inequality, and social inclusion. I think the message has been very clear. We need to really do much more to really combat inequality, to offer opportunity to those people who are left behind, to pretty much improve opportunities for everybody. But of course, most of these lessons that I've had throughout this week are also lessons that we kind of drew when we were preparing most of the documentation for this session. And I think the most important lesson that really sticks to me is the importance of policies and institutions. The key that we have to look at is when countries are formulating policies, whether it's fiscal policies, wage policies, or social protection policies, who is sitting on that table? Are we hearing the voices of everybody? We heard from our keynote speaker that when it comes to fiscal or ministers of finance, you hardly find a woman as a minister of finance. That's an important voice that is missing. We all know that women, 51%, right? They hold the sky. So why are they not there to really shape the policies that impact the way revenues are collected and the way those revenues are spent? These are public resources. So I think we know that sometimes when you collect revenues through taxation, you tend to harm the poor more through consumptive taxes, right? Or the tax cuts that you come up with as a government, you tend to benefit the rich at the expense of the poor. But if you have groups like the people in this room sitting at that table, when you formulate those policies, I think the harmful effects of certain fiscal policies can be lessened. Another important lesson that we all know is the importance of these austerity measures. They have been very harmful to inequality, very harmful to poverty, very harmful to social inclusion. When you take away child care services from women, they are not able to participate in the labor force as they used to. So why should we promote policies that take away somebody's ability to participate in the labor market through these fiscal policies? These are issues that are of concern to us. The other issue that I think that's very important is the way we spend public resources to invest in infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure do we need? Basic rural roads that allow a rural farmer in Ethiopia to sell his or her products at the market before they get bad is what we need. So let's invest in infrastructure that makes a difference to the lives of those people who need it most. We also learned that, yes, you can actually reduce inequality by investing significantly in education, particularly in higher education. But we have also seen evidence that higher levels of education tend to benefit children from backgrounds that are of high socioeconomic status. It's not necessarily the poor who are benefiting. So yes, while education is very important to reducing inequality, it can also worsen inequality if it's not targeted well. We also learned the importance of what do you do with subsidies? Fuel subsidies, energy subsidies, food subsidies. These are important elements that really impact the pockets of people living in poverty or other vulnerable groups. So when governments make decisions on who gets subsidies, are those subsidies done, or those policies surrounding subsidies, done in a way that benefits the people who deserve those subsidies more, or it benefits those who can afford. Issues like fuel subsidies. Who tends to benefit? If you give me a fuel subsidy, I can afford my gas, right? But somebody really who needs it, does that person get that subsidy? I think those are important policies that we need to look at. When you look at social protection, for us in the UN, I think it's important that we continue to hammer this message. We need universal social protection that is human rights based. We cannot promote social safety nets ahead of universal social protection. Yes, in the era of austerity, social safety nets are cheaper, right? You only target a few people, and then you think you have done your job. But if you offer universal social protection, that stretches from the time somebody is born to the day they leave planet Earth, I think you can really make a difference in combating inequality and reducing poverty. So what should be done? I think McKinsey wrote an interesting publication called How to Make Green Growth the New Normal. And they say that we need about $3 trillion a year to build a resource-efficient growth model. $3 trillion is a lot of money, right? But of course, for me or for us, I think the key is to invest in sustainable solutions, whether it's clean energy, smart irrigation technologies. We also need, most importantly, to empower people living in poverty and those left further behind. And I think those are important lessons that we can all learn going forward. And obviously, the most important thing that we also need to emphasize is the importance of learning. How do countries learn from each other? And I think the UN system has this amazing convening power that brings all member states to share their national experiences. And we also have the increasing role of civil society in these processes. I think it's not about the UN telling member states what to do. The UN should facilitate member states' engagements and probably help member states to raise the necessary resources for them to implement the programs that make sense in their national context. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amson. Of all the wonderful things you said, I found the most significant is this idea of the UN being a house of learning. I think that is a dimension that is missing from how we approach this space, both as civil society as well as member states. So I'm grateful to you for that contribution among many others. I now have the pleasure of introducing once again Helen Modora. She is a human rights defender with a special interest in vulnerable groups. You heard from her this morning, so you are already aware that she has a very practical understanding of the reality on the ground, and I look forward to learning more from her. Helen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I would like to thank the NGO committee for inviting me to be part of this panel, and also the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for their support in making me to come and share our experiences from the Africa Platform for Social Protection. We do have 27 national platforms in different countries in Africa to look at and to push for rights-based social protection. I will just take on from Philip Halston the issue of sustaining accountability, and from my other speakers, the issue of rights-based social protection. The model which we use at the Africa Platform for Social Protection is monitoring social rights through social accountability. We take the government charter, what the government says how it's going to provide services for cash transfer programs, and then we develop a social accountability tool based on that. So, for example, we ask the beneficiaries their level of awareness of the government programs. Are they aware of the money that is coming in the communities? Whose money? What is it for? Who is it meant for? How are they participating in the targeting process and other information that the government needs to provide about the cash transfers? We look at the timeliness of payments. If it's a rights-based approach, in Kenya, for example, the government gives $20 every month, but it's given every 2 months. So if it delays to come after 2 months, it means there's a lot of pressure that the beneficiaries get because they have already committed themselves to spending and doing other things, so they will not be able to do that. The distance to collection points, those of us who come from Africa know that people walk long distances, 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers for different services. So going to get the money 30 kilometers away, or having to spend that money on a taxi and back if you're an older person or person with disability may not make economic sense. Dignity in service provision. So I said earlier that sometimes when you provide services for the poor, we don't look at the dignity, that they don't have any dignity in receiving the service. And then we also strengthen the complaints and redress mechanism, that the beneficiaries have a right to complain if the service is delayed or if it is not given in the way it is supposed to be. We have seen that there is improved knowledge, and there's definitely an improvement in service delivery. I will just look at the payment process in the Kenyan context. We started with long lines in some pay points. We went to mobile banking. Telephone mobile banking. We found that had a problem. Now the beneficiaries get the money from the banks. It is not yet 100%. There are a lot of challenges with that, but we are seeing the government improving the systems based on the information that we give them. We also see that beneficiaries are very confident in claiming their rights. There is an improvement in how beneficiaries are able to engage in the policy-making process, and most importantly, the government is very receptive of our feedback because we put it in a scientific way. We get a sample, we get the responses, we analyze the data, and present the data in a way that the government is able to take action. The challenges that civil societies face, one, limited resources for civil society organizations. We are seeing that the basket is shrinking, short-term projects without core funding. In the African context, at least I know, we can go for months without pay. And therefore, we are wondering, we are talking about social protection for the poor, but the NGO sector seems to be very poor in giving social protection to its own workers. So that is something we must look at. And also civil society organizations, how do we build our own resources so that we don't depend on foreign funding and other funding? I know that civil society organizations sometimes have asked donors, if I'm going to spend 3, 4, 5 million in the 5 years for rent, why can't I buy a space so that I don't have to keep on thinking about rent? Sometimes it's accepted, sometimes it's not accepted. But I think from somebody who has been a practitioner in the civil society for so long, I wish our donors would accept to help us to get even, a space so that we can work, it is more sustainable. We also see the shrinking space of CSOs. We heard from Philip that governments are signing out from human rights treaties. We are seeing excessive use of force, militarization, which makes it very difficult for civil society organizations who are doing advocacy work. We have to find other ways of engaging, and we also need a lot of support for human rights defenders because most of them become at risk under those circumstances. We are also seeing competition among international organizations and local organizations. It is not unusual to find an international organization working in a small, remote village in Africa. What does that mean? You have pushed the national organizations out. You are even going further to push the small community groups out of their jobs. So we need to find a balance in terms of how we are implementing from international to the local to make sure that everybody has that space. And I know my previous speaker, Amson, has talked about who is always on that table. We are increasingly seeing when you are not able to bring money around the table in the government policy-making process, you don't have a voice. So those who end up having voices would be international organizations at the expense of the local organizations. Foreign financial support complicates CSO work. When we receive funding from international or foreign countries, we are always accused of pushing for foreign agendas. Even when it is very, very, providing a service,
but we are always told that's a foreign agenda you're pushing. So how do we generate our own resources? And finally, I think the solution mainly for us, and that is the message I hope you will take out of this, is for civil society to empower our groups, our beneficiaries, our community groups for self-advocacy. The day our citizens are able to stand up and speak for themselves, self-mobilize, I think that's the day we will know we will have done a lot. I have seen that in South Africa, the cash transfer programs in South Africa. Whenever the money is delayed, it is the beneficiaries themselves who organize themselves to go and complain. And I think that is where we should all head to. Thank you very much.
So I want to express profound gratitude to all of our panelists. I think that we have quite well described the elephant that is the challenges and opportunities facing humanity. I'm really grateful to you. I also think that each of you has touched on all three dimensions, the symptoms, the disease, and the causes. And all three of those are really vital, and I'm just so pleased that we have had this opportunity and that we have nearly an hour remaining for interactive dialogue. However, I also am very pleased. You may think I'm the happiest man there could be, but I'm also quite pleased to acknowledge that the chair of the commission has joined us. As you know, he was otherwise occupied this morning with a gentleman, I believe the Secretary General, and for that reason had to delay his presence, but he thought to come anyway and offer his support for what we're doing here. And I'll give Ambassador Niang the floor.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président, de m'avoir donné la parole. Comme vous l'avez si bien dit, je tenais.
Thank you very much. As you very well noted, so there was an engagement with the Secretary General, and I found it necessary to send a representative to be here. Thank you very much for your understanding. It's with much conviction that I come here. In my opinion, it is important that all of the concerned parties be able to produce what they wish to see. This process is an intergovernmental process. It is evident that civil society must, not just can, but must play an essential role in this process, especially in finding solutions. The governmental actors have to follow certain very particular logics. These logics don't always necessarily go beyond their national boundaries, but they should. This needs to be an international endeavor. We are very familiar with this process, and we often find people who are doing this kind of work. And I have to really commend all of the people on the panel for the important work that they're doing. It is important that civil society be an important partner in these endeavors. It cannot be left out of finding these solutions, as my fellow panelists have said. We must listen to civil society. We have parallel platforms, and people in their own sectors do their own work, and sometimes this is done in parallel, but not always in conjunction with each other, not always in the most efficient way. And I hope that bringing together the various sides of civil society will help to make this conversation be more fluid, and people can be talking across the different sectors to find solutions together. It is important for all of us to interact in order to look out for the best interests of the most vulnerable populations, and of course include them in finding these solutions to get out of extreme poverty and misery. I would like to thank all of you here for your engagement and your dedication to these very important goals. It's truly a labor of love. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for your encouraging words and for your offer of continuing partnership. We are most grateful to you and to Senegal for your chairmanship and for the continuation of your role to the next commission as well, so we can continue to strengthen this relationship. And thank you again for coming. Now, I have seen a number of individuals who have asked for the floor already. I will do my best, and I would just please request that you keep your interventions limited in time so that we can maximize participation. I see first this gentleman in the red tie, the woman next to him, and Memo in the back. And I see, yes, I will begin to take note. Please, sir, you have the floor.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yursanen. I'm a human rights activist, human rights advocate, and I'm from Haiti. I'm honored to be here today in this great conference where the civil society are getting together to see how we can empower the whole world. As of now, my country, Haiti, is facing a very bad difficulty, as you all may know, and we are not here to seek for pity, but we're here to seek for solidarity for Haiti. We're not here to ask for money, but we need ideas and help. Because in 1945, after World War II, Haiti was among the 50 states that built the United Nations, and we have many other countries. But what we realize is that in Haiti, the civil society has failed. It's because after the earthquake of 2010, we have more than 10,000 NGOs who collected billions of dollars on behalf of Haiti, who have not done what they're supposed to do. The Red Cross already only built 5 or 6 housing with $500 million they collected, and $13 billion were raised in the name of Haiti to rebuild the country. And then after 9 years, we're still asking where is the money goes. The private sector has not done anything. The religious community has stayed quiet. And the United Nations has not really fought to help Haiti. So I'm here today to see how the civil society can advocate for Haiti, because as of now, we have about 14 days since the country is fighting. They're killing each other. They asked for the president to resign. Even the ambassador of Haiti at the UN, I think they call him back home. He might be fired because the job have not done. So how can we help Haiti to be ready for sustainable development, to be ready to sustain for 2030? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Queen Mother.
Yes, I'm Queen Mother Dr. Deloise Blakely. I'm the community mayor of Harlem and the ambassador of goodwill to Africa. I also sit here today celebrating my 50 years here at the United Nations as a humanitarian, receiving $1 a year for each year. I want to say to you, as a daughter of the transatlantic ocean of the slave trade, the greatest crime ever committed against a people. And when you mention the word, I'm sorry that the professor is not here. about human rights. When you think of Wall Street, where my ancestors were sold, and then you look at Queen Mother sitting here, want to be engaged continuously of the poor and the powerless around the world. And the question I guess I asked all of us in this room, how do we come together to sustain each other of the 17 goals that we are talking about here today and every day? How do we do it? By engaging the business, the corporate America and corporate of the world, a part of this conversation for the holistic involvement. And as an agitator, I go to Wall Street to do just that, agitate. And I do it here at the United Nations, agitate, for the last 50 years. How do we holistically now come together and left no one behind based on the decision of a solution of implementation for those that are vulnerable within our society? How do we do that from civil society? And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Guillermo.
Campuzano, Congregation of the Mission of the Vincentian Family. Of the Congregation of the Mission of the Vincentian Family. Hello? Guillermo Campuzano, Congregation of the Mission of the Vincentian Family. I'm sorry. So I would like to add an element that for me is an essential symptom and an effect of inequality, is political corruption. The system that allows inequality is embedded in the political, in socioeconomic system. And to address inequality is also to address the symptom and the effect in the political system. The root causes of inequality are embedded in a system that allows inequality because one of the groups that benefit more from the system are politicians itself. The group benefits and the group causes inequality. And if we do not face political corruption in many places in the world, the political will won't change because politicians will continue to benefit from the systems that they create and that allow inequality systemically. And is a missing, an essential missing point in the SDGs. And it is usually a missing point, an essential missing point in the conversations of this political forum that is the UN. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo. If the light turns red, you're on. Speaking of which, you're on. No, not Sandra. Behind Sandra.
Hello. Good morning. My name is Johanna Backline. I work for an organization that provides services for people with intellectual disabilities in the New York City metropolitan area, but also we are trying to support increasing the inclusion for people with intellectual disabilities worldwide. And we're present here. And my question is, because I have the task assigned to try to find connections internationally, and it would be so nice. I'm always waiting for an Uber or for an Airbnb where we can all connect, and I know we spoke about this morning on the panel as well. How do we better work together and connect on the right issues with the right people, because we have so many important people in the room who can work effectively together. And I would just be very interested to hear from the panel what solutions do you see to really bring our efforts together and how we can use technology to make that happen? Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Sandra.
My name is Sandra Vermaeten. I work with Public Services International. I just wanted to say that I think this CSO forum rocks. Yeah, I'm really happy that I think Philip Halston's couldn't have been more clear about the impact of privatization, and I think some of the contributions in this panel were also really awesome. We've been talking a lot in this commission on social protection and on public policies, but somehow the issue of wages, besides some references to minimal wages, have kind of been taken out of the equation, because of course minimum wages are important, but living wages, decent wages, are really a driver to address inequality, and maybe I think Henry maybe could share something about the Fight for 15 and what that means also in New York City, because I know that from the 1st of January of this year, the minimum wage in New York is $15 an hour, and that didn't come about by itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. So what we'll do is we'll go to the panel for roughly 2 minutes each. But if you want to cede your time now and hold off till later, you'll get 4 minutes. So I'll leave the decision to you, how you want to proceed, but a couple of you have received direct questions, and then I see that there are others in the audience who would like to further contribute. So Henry.
Yeah, I negotiate contracts for a living. You take what you get up front, and then you get the other two later. So let me address something that Sandra said. I think that it's an important, because I think that there's an opportunity for a synergy of multi-level discussions about around the same theme of inequality that we need to start having discussions following this week in the panel. The 5 for 15 was the single most important movement capturing the imagination of working people in the United States in the last 20 years, in my opinion. The problem was when you were driving to 15, it wasn't just 15. It was supposed to be 15 in a union. Because wages, on the one hand, were being raised, which was great. I myself had 10,000 employees here in New York City who work for city governments whose salaries went up beginning January 1st. But in many instances, in order to make up for those salaries being raised, the employer then tried to take it out on the health insurance side, or try to take it out on increasing the contributions in the pension, because at the end, there was a totality of cost. And I think that we have to get away from this idea that if we're going to be making a dent in moving income inequality, that we are waiting for some messiah that's going to deliver us out. There's collective actions that are taking place right now. We saw it in Amazon by average, regular, hardworking people that are making the biggest differences in this society. And instead of waiting for somebody who's going to be the picture, the next candidate, somebody mentioned the next elected officials, that's going to bring us to the promised land, we need to continue to encourage social activism among grassroots. Because movements that we've seen, not just the 5 for 15, but what's happening with the women's movement here in the United States, grassroots movement, people demanding change. We saw it with Occupy Wall Street. We saw it in many different manifestations. We've seen it now with labor unions waking up after being attacked in the public sector and signing more members than it has in over 3 decades. And so I think that there's a lot to be said. We ought to be concerned and outraged at what's happening in Haiti. We ought to be concerned and outraged at what's happening in Harlem. And we don't need to choose whether we're equally outraged with Haiti that we are with what our outrage on Harlem, or somewhere in Queens where one of our workers are there. There is an intersectionality of these pieces, and I think that we need to encourage more social collective actions rather than individual heroism of individual people to promote those principles. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. If you would like.
So just quickly on the issue around the transatlantic slave trade, I think it's very important, Sister, that you brought that. One of the pieces that I didn't get to talk about is the role of criminalization of poor people and the direct impact on, on African American, Latinx people particularly. And so any policy around inequality has to counter our criminal justice policies, that we can no longer put civil and criminal sort of as in isolation. We're seeing the increased criminalization of our young people. So I think that's an important piece, and I think that's a legacy, to be quite frank, of our history of slavery in the United States, but also a history of colonialism around the globe. Maybe my point, Sister, around wages was lost. New York City was the first municipality to pass a minimum wage for app drivers, so Uber, Lyft, Juno. That guarantees $17, a little bit more wage. And I'm not going to go into the formula of it. Not surprisingly, Juno and Lyft are litigating that in court. So we need to really support, immigrant drivers when those legislations are passed. We haven't talked about municipal strategies. We also, the role of us as purchasers, government as purchasers and vendors to dictate norms and standards. So I just wanted to kind of lift that up, that maybe that wasn't sort of heard in my original piece. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is technology. I consider myself a digital migrant, meaning that I used phones that were connected to a wire in the wall, not a cell phone. So meaning that, in terms of technology, like, I've learned a lot, and there's a lot of technology that we can use. The other role that I have, other than being a law professor, is the founder of a law and media platform called Law at the Margins. We use the technology as a way to host conversations within organizers. And there's no reason why we couldn't use those similar Crowdcast, Slack, Zoom, all of these platforms for us to be engaged with each other. And, we are happy to be able to facilitate that. We are not funded, so it's really a labor of love. But I think technology can play a key role in facilitating our conversations amongst each other.
So I want to address the question on the Wall Street, also because since my company is based close to Wall Street, and I want to address also the question of what can we do or how do we come together to sustain each other. I'm always, in my experience, I'm a firm believer that we really need to start from our own. We need to start locally to the people right next to us. When I was in Los Angeles, I was working for a bank, and I was a manager, and they promoted me as the assistant vice president. And I saw how pyramidal it is. The higher you go, the bigger the pie you have, and the actual people that are doing the work gets less and less. So when bonus time came, I saw how it was injustice, that I would get a lot of bonus while the people that were working, the technicians, the ones that are moving the PCs, taking care of the computers, were getting little. So I said, this is not fair. We should be able to give more to them. And in the financial world, that's a little bit on a different side of business. So I was accused as a communist, a socialist, but I became the most popular and most successful communist department in that bank, and they keep promoting us more and more because that created such a tight unit to be saying that I got your back and you got my back. So now also in Wall Street, I said, why should I go to Wall Street where you have all the challenges in there, the corruption? And yes, right away from the very beginning, I couldn't believe how collusion is rampant, how much corruption is there. And precisely because of that, I said, I have to stay here to show a different voice. The way my company does pricing, the way we look at even the billing, we have to respect our billing, our clients, we have to be true to it. And in all those small things, as I create these relationships locally, people are watching, companies are watching, and they see that it's successful, and they bring that ahead. So that's, I think, is what I've seen, is to really think globally, but act locally, because that's really your sphere of influence, and that has a ripple effect. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Guillermo raised an issue which is important, political corruption. That's why I began my remarks by saying that one of the most important lessons that we have learned is that the importance of policies and institutions. If you have good institutions that serve people, that prioritize the needs of the people, I think you can, to some extent, fight corruption. If you look at the discussions within the UN, starting from the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, on how the international community needs to come together and tackle the issue of illicit financial flows, I think that goes to one of the key elements that you raise of corruption. So I think the work that is being done within the system to come with strategies to tackle illicit financial flows is very, very critical, especially when it comes to issues like tax havens. On the issue of wages, I think this is Sandra's issue. I think it's very important for us to understand that the international community has what is called the Decent Work Agenda, which is pretty much ILO work. The Decent Work Agenda, if it's implemented in its entirety, the issues that we are concerned about when it comes to wages will be fully addressed, because we are talking of collective bargaining issues that they're very, very important. Setting a minimum living wage, that's very, very important. And obviously making sure that wage growth is tied to everything that happens in the economy. So I think those are very, very important elements. Let's promote the Decent Work Agenda. Let's make sure that we achieve equal pay for work of equal value. So there are many elements. Yes, minimum wages are very, very critical, because the people at the bottom need to see their minimum wages rise so that at least they can have a decent living standard. Thank you.
I will respond to Queen Mother's question on SDGs. I think we need to get the SDGs out of the boardroom for citizens to understand what do they really mean. And because a lot of times it's like negotiations between our countries and the UN. It looks elitist, it looks it's up there, I have no role in it. But if we make it simple and raise awareness on it and how it impacts on me as an individual, then I'm sure our citizens will start doing some work around it. And then on the issue of Haiti, I think Philip talked about sustained accountability. And I think CSOs have a role to hold our governments to account, but we also have a responsibility to generate that evidence. The statistics that you're raising, if you package it in a way that can demonstrate how the fraud has happened, you know, and so that we use that with policymakers, I think that can work. Thank you.
I would also try to respond to what Queen Mother said. I think over the past week, I've been a champion of social entrepreneurship and technology, because I feel technology would be the way that we, the youths, can champion scaling solutions to tackle the SDGs. And I think technology as well would help us to create like sustained accountability, as like she just said. And in Africa as well, you know, there's an issue of data and how to analyze this data. I think using technology to build these social platforms would help us to get data naturally, and we can actually tailor such data to solve, you know, our problems. I think lastly, I would say, okay, for example, I think for the past 15 years ago, no one knew Facebook. But today, we all know Facebook, and all of us are on Facebook. So that's just an example of what technology can do. And Facebook has like 1.74 billion users as of today. And when we are talking about Africa and we're talking about like cross-border interventions, you know, we shouldn't shy away from using technology, because that's the only way we can scale these interventions to reach even the remote parts of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, as you know, I always try to deliver good news with the bad news. So the bad news is that there are 23 minutes remaining, and there are 8 people on the list, plus 6 or 7 panelists, which means that we will have limited time to hear from you. But the good news is that this afternoon is meant for that kind of interaction that we have been speaking about this morning-ish. And we will break out by regions. You can find people who have similar missions and aspirations and work with them. So this is not the end of the forum, but these 8 speakers, and if you have a burning thing, I can maybe make it 9, we'll have the floor now. So please be patient with each other. We'll start with Maureen and then the woman behind her.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maureen, and I'm from Worldwide Network, Nigeria. My question, rather a comment, basically, is more in the sense that not all young persons might be engaged in humanitarian activities, but we would like a place whereby young people who are really interested are encouraged, rather mentored, so that when we come for events like this, we can have young people actually fully represented here on the floor. And there's this burning question that keeps coming up when I go for rural outreaches. Younger persons than myself keep asking me, how do we engage more with people who are in government? And I don't think I have the right answers for them anytime I speak to them. So I really like to know, how do they really engage? How do they come and get their voices heard to as well? Not all of us will be able to come to the UN every year. So how do we really do that? Thank you.
You have to push the button with the little talkie person. There you go.
I wasn't sure who it was. Sharon Fisher, Seroptimist International. And I would like to just comment in particular to Ms. Madura because of her comments on community. And the organization I'm with in my employment is involved in community response networks. So we do have core funding, which is vital because we don't have to rely on grants. It's renewed every 3 years. And we are able to go into communities throughout our region and develop networks of service providers, community volunteers, and interested parties, knowing that every community is different and needs something different to address their problems of whether it's indigenous people, people with disabilities. And then, of course, we evaluate the results and feed it back up through the government so that our funding is, again, secured, which provides the stats. And I just wanted to say that it's been a very interesting panel, and I'm pleased that our techniques are working and are some of the suggestions I'm hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Marlene. I'm from Mexico, and I'm leading a network of young people working on the SDGs. And I'm so impressed for all the information that we have received here, mainly with the human rights approach that you have given to us, because I think that it's quite important. I have 2 questions. The first one is how we make that the government, like the public sector, the private sector, and everybody working on the SDGs or providing public services as an example, how they could embrace this human rights approach. Because I think that it's important if you, for example, provide services, not looking the people like it's my job for providing public services, but it's a fact or it's a matter of human rights. I'm not doing this because it's my job, part of my task, but like to change this, like the paradigm shift in them, like thinking, I'm providing this because it's a fact or it's a matter of human rights. This is the first, like my first question. And the second one is, I think that human rights must be in the center, as I have said. But how to make, when we are talking about, for example, rights such as job, the rights of labor jobs, rights, how to make that they look this important, because if this not a right that it's related to like to the life itself, sometimes the governments or even the private sector, they don't think that it's important. If we are talking about, for example, health, it is not important, because like the argument that they usually, or I have heard before, it's a matter of money. And I think that we could not like say all the time that it's the money, like the problem, because I think that it's like a mix of other things. So how to make that they think that these rights are also important, because I think that it's an important thing when we are talking about inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sir, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sinon Sil. I'm here on behalf of the Cambodian Alliance for Paris Peace Agreement on Cambodia, and on behalf of the Cambodian people who is living inside the country that their mouth has been shut by the communist regime. My organization working mostly focus on the human rights and democracy. At the recent times, the government has put pressure on the human rights and democracy. So I would like to suggest all of you here who is working especially with the human rights have to support us, to go with us, to aware of what is happening in our countries, so that the UN can aware of it and to restore the democracy in Cambodia, follow the Paris Peace Agreement that has been signed by the 19 countries, including the 5 power countries, to have the free and fair election and to end the civil war in the past. The treaty has been signed on the 23rd of October 1991, but 27 years later, Cambodia now turned back to the dictatorship regimes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Margaret O'Dwyer, Company of the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, part of the Vincentian family. I echo the concern of our representative from Mexico, and the words of the Special Rapporteur echo in my ears. What are 1 or 2 activities we can do to call upon our governments to up the ante on accountability in terms of corporations and public-private partnerships? Thank you.
Thank you. Sylvia.
Much. My name is Sylvia, and I work with a number of organizations, including the Africa Platform, the Global Coalition Against Poverty, and Grey Panthers. And I just want to say how great it is that we are really starting to talk about how human rights can and should underpin social policy decisions. But this is not easy, because we have to accept that we are rights holders, and our governments are also rights holders as well as duty bearers. And I want to raise the question of social protection in a sustainable sense. In a way, Helen referred to this. How do governments ensure these things are paid for? Through taxation. We have not talked about taxation. We need to talk about the elephant in the room that all of us, as duty bearers and rights holders, need to be prepared to pay for the services that we all require and have a right to. And it would be really good to have a sense of that from the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman behind.
So I am Ed. I am Edwin John from Neighborhood Community Network, India. And my thinking with regard to ensuring that people get equality is to ensure a new system, not the government system or the UN system, people's system, where people at the base have an empowered ongoing provision to have their claims expressed and their demands really felt. And for this, we tried in our organization, we come up with 2 new words. One is smallification. If people at the base have to talk, they need small forums. In bigger forums, only the big people can talk, and the small voices go unheard. They become voiceless. So it's smallification. Organize all the people into small forums. The next word we give is neighborhoodization. If we have to include all in a talking process, you have to organize on the base of the neighborhood, territorial neighborhoods. So small-sized territorial forums linked at various levels through representative structures, that they remain a system of people's participation by the people at the base. And some experiments have already been done in this. One experiment that comes to my mind immediately is one state in Kerala, a state called Kerala in India. They organized neighborhood forums for the poor women to begin with. And then they were federated, linked together through representative structures at the next governance level and the third local governance level. And that was supposed to be for eradicating absolute poverty. But in the last few years, what has happened for these poor women, in a country where women were not supposed to come for public decision-making meetings, not meant to socialize much, in such a place, in that state, in the last 2 consecutive elections, more women got elected to local governance than men. So this way, if we give structures to people, people will participate, and for this we all have to work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My sister's in the back.
Is it this one? Okay. Yeah. My name is Hayat. I represent the International Islamic Relief Organization. I am the General Supervisor of the Women Section in the organization. My organization assists social groups through its 42 offices around the world. The services are offered for Muslims and non-Muslims. As it is a humanitarian organization, it works for the whole. It constructs camps for refugees, centers for orphans, provide educational and health cares. There is a significant point and very important point that I really need to mention in this at this time, and I want to share with you, everybody. In our country, Saudi Arabia, the inequality in wages is not an issue at all. Why? Because men and women get the same salary according to their degree and experience, despite of their sex, if they are men or women, despite if they are persons with disabilities or not. They are all equal in opportunities for jobs and salaries. Women in my country now, they are deputy ministers. Women in my country, they are leading their own businesses and establishments. I wish women around the world get equal salaries to men as my country does. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Final comment.
It's great. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Yetunde Odubesin, Professor of Politics and Global Affairs at Farmingdale State College. I'm actually particularly interested in goal number 17. I'm trying to figure out how CSOs are able to work with governments and actually multinational corporations when many of their decisions and policies are counteractive to the work that CSOs are actually doing. Many of the developing countries are structurally adjusted through the IMF and World Bank. So all of the things like wage suppression, privatization, all of these issues that we're focusing on are primarily the results of governmental decisions. So how do you build that partnership where the institutions you're building with are not counteractive to the work that you're doing?
Thank you very much for the very easy questions you've all put forward. I think one-word answers will suffice. No, please be as brief as possible. I'm actually going to start with Henry to be just 1 minute because he has to depart very soon.
The power has always remained in the people. And if we work together, all of these issues, and we begin to demand, as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. If we begin to demand changes, we're going to get them done. Thank you.
You've set a great example. Now let's come this way, the opposite way from how we did. So Helen, go ahead, please.
I think I cannot overemphasize the need for self-organizing. Just like some of the speakers on the floor have said, that we need to have our groups, our community groups, the people we work with, even if they are vulnerable, we build their capacity for self-advocacy. And I think I'd also like to respond to the issue about human rights. It takes a lot to shift the mind so that people can integrate human rights in their daily practices. So it is something that we have to do over time. And to address what Sylvia has just asked, we see a trend where sometimes for the cash transfers, we see pilots which are funded by international organizations, and then governments take over. But even as they take over, again, they are given debt. So they're using debt to finance cash transfers. So how sustainable is that? We are already putting a burden on future generations. So those are some of the issues that civil society organizations need to address in their countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thanks. In order to make social protection a right, I think there are important lessons that we learned this week. The most important thing is, do we count our most vulnerable members of society? Do they exist in our database? India told us a story of their national IDs, the new system that they have, which allows vulnerable and marginalized groups to access basic services. So just having that data set where everybody counts and is counted is important. And then, of course, your constitution is very, very important. The issue of how do we pay for it? I think it was Finland who said that they don't mind high taxes, right? As long as the middle class and everybody sees that they all benefit from paying, then I think that's very, very important. And you don't need high walls to protect your house when your neighbor has a decent job and there's a living wage. And lastly, to Edunte, I think, yes. I think, yes, we know the issues of structure adjustment, but as long as we understand that the Washington Consensus did push so many of these things, but not giving up on putting a spotlight on the harmful effects of certain policies, I think will help the international community to address some of those issues. Thank you.
There are 4 minutes and 4 of us. Please.
So I just wanted to highlight what Maureen had asked, the importance of formation for young people. And that's part of with the economy of communion that I had talked about. part of its profits goes to creating institutions or these incubation periods or incubation places where young people could learn how to start their businesses. In fact, Elizabeth, one of the young girls, based from this, started her own company in the Midwest to provide jobs for incarcerated women. I think also there's also a lot of things that are happening in the private sectors. I have two other clients that the other day he runs a multi-million company, tech company, and I see him preparing cookies for kids that will be visiting the company. So again, that's and the companies that are hiring disadvantaged women. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of good things happening in the private sector. They may not be heard, but they are being done, and they should be highlighted.
Thank you.
So three things. Hold corporations legally liable and responsible for corporate accountability at the local, state, and international level. Amazon is a great case study of engaging local politicians to counter, which would have been a sort of a giveaway of tax money to a large company. So look at that as a case in point. And then lastly, one of the reasons why I became a law professor is because I think it's important to engage young people, sister. And so I actually think that young people have the answers. You don't need to go to the politicians. Use Twitter, video, and make them come to you. And in fact, as public servants, that's their job, is to come to you. And so use media, and I think the brother has mentioned before, I think young people use social media in very powerful ways. And so I think that would be my message is everybody has a cell phone. In Bangladesh, even in the most ruralist areas, everyone has a cell phone, can make a video, put it on Twitter, and you know what? Your message is out there.
And Mona?
I would try to answer, comment on what Maureen said, and probably Sylvia as well. So for young people's voices to be heard from the grassroots, I think we have to think about creating small-sized forums to kind of bring their voices to the floor of the UN ourselves, since they can't. And also we should develop people-centered systems, because sometimes there's lack of political will, or we know that what the government are doing is not sustainable. So we have to kind of try to create our own systems that we know are sustainable. I can just come up with a rough example in my head, like a tomato farmer in Plateau State, in Jos, in Nigeria. The tomato gets rotten if, she doesn't sell them. We as NGOs or civil society can come, train her up to kind of process these tomatoes, to package them into bottles so they have a long time shelf life. That gives her a bargaining power to sell at a higher price. And, that, to me, it's better and more sustainable than giving her cash handouts because she's a farmer and, she can't really feed her family. So teaching and empowering the grassroots community on how to develop themselves and sustain themselves, to me, is a more practical and sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do the unenviable and try to summarize some of the things which I heard. So I ask forgiveness because I will fall short in my attempt. Firstly, I think this notion of individual responsibility paired with collective action really came to the fore here. This idea that we have to acknowledge the problems, understand them, but not become entrenched in them, and always be looking forward to the next opportunity. There's this phrase that actually has its good and bad in my mind, which is the long is road, but the road is long, but it bends towards justice. Or the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. The problem with that, though, is that it implies a linear arc. But progress is not linear, and so we have to recognize that with every setback, there's an opportunity for advancement. We must continue to learn from it. Yes, I will stop there. And I also would like to just say, this afternoon we'll reconvene in here at 3 p.m. for breakout groups and more consultations. There will also be the approval, so to speak, of the Civil Society Declaration, which I hope will happen without tremendous discontent. And I wish you all a wonderful lunch. Thank you so much to this excellent panel. And we will see you at 3 o'clock. Thank you again. And thank you, of course, to the interpreters. My apologies. Thank you, interpreters.